Mosaic is brought to you in part by these generous corporate sponsors. Learn how you can support Mosaic by visiting jewishpb.org/mosaic.
Welcome to Mosaic. I'm your host, Susan Schulman-Pertnoy. Mosaic is Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County's weekly news magazine, exploring the most critical issues facing Jews here and around the world. As the physical toll from the pandemic continues to be well documented, a mental and emotional health crisis is spreading. Today, we'll hear from renowned expert on happiness, Tal Ben-Shahar, about how the crisis is reinventing ways to cope with the stress so many are under. We'll be right back. Joining us today is a well-known author, lecturer, and professor. He's also an expert in happiness. And when he taught at Harvard, his class, The Science of Happiness, was the most popular class at its time. We are thrilled to welcome back to Mosaic, Tal Ben-Shahar.
It's great to be back, Susan. Thank you.
You know, the last time you were here, the world was a different place. This is a year like no other. The pandemic has wreaked havoc on our emotions. We are filled with anxiety, depression, sadness, fear, to name a few. So tell us, how does happiness even play a role today? Is it relevant?
Yeah, you know, one of my friends recently said to me, Tal, shouldn't we quarantine happiness, at least until better times are upon us? And my answer is no. I think that happiness is extremely relevant now. Why? Because what the science of happiness can do is not just make us feel better in good times. It can also help us better deal with difficult times. In other words, it can help us become more resilient, stronger, strengthen our psychological immune system.
So we're constantly bombarded by advice from all sorts of sources. How do we deal with this? It's confusing.
Yeah, so the first thing is really to embrace the confusion, to accept and embrace the hardship. You know, the worst thing that we can do probably at this time is say to ourselves, well, I should be strong, or I shouldn't be feeling, anxious, sad, frustrated, or, fill in the blanks. So the first step is embracing, accepting whatever emotion comes up. And many emotions do come up, and they are confusing. Many of them are difficult. Some are joyful and pleasurable, and then there is guilt associated with that. And we should embrace that as well. So that really is the first step.
You've talked about the ABCs of psychology to help cope with this crisis. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So the ABCs stand for affect, which is emotion, behavior, action, and then the C stands for cognition or thought. And under each one of these, there are certain tools and techniques that we can apply in our lives in order to deal with difficulties, hardships. For example, when it comes to the A, affect, the first thing is embracing painful emotions. The second is cultivating pleasurable ones. There's no more important time than now to express gratitude. There's no more important time than now to find even short experiences of pleasurable emotions, and whether we get it by watching a favorite series, or whether it's by listening to music, or by finding reasons to laugh. And small changes can make a very big difference. So, people talk about distractions as being necessarily bad. Well, not so. Being distracted from the daily bombardment of bad news, and injecting small, short, brief experiences of pleasurable emotions, that's a welcome change.
I just want to jump in here for 1 second, because what you just said about bombarded with the news. I know so many people that just focus in on the news almost 24/7, and it's so destructive for them. Could you elaborate on that a little more?
Exactly that. So, I'm not saying, to bury our head in the sand and ignore what's going on around us. Not at all. But what I am saying is that we should use moderation here. So yes, be informed, and at the same time also create what I've come to call islands of sanity throughout the day. And again, these islands of sanity can be brief, pleasurable emotions that we inject our life with. Second, when it comes to behavior action, it's very easy to do nothing when things are not going well, and to sink into this sort of blur's day experience. And what we need to do is do things that lift us up. And again, they don't have to be major, but small things that we know make us feel better. That could be dancing. It could be exercising. Now is, again, the most important time to exercise is now. Raise our serotonin, dopamine levels. Take action in terms of charity, giving, helping other people, listening to other people. These are, again, activities that can raise us, even if it is a little bit. And finally, just one thing about cognition, about the thought. What do we think about? So, keeping a journal could really help now. There's a lot of research coming out of different universities around the world showing how even 2 minutes or 5 minutes of keeping a journal and writing about the things that we're going through, that can go a long way in alleviating some of the difficulty.
What is the biggest predictor of happiness?
Number one predictor of happiness, hands down, relationships. And that, of course, doesn't bode well for this time, because it's about real relationships rather than virtual relationships. The thing, though, is that even during these times, even if we are experiencing social isolation, social distancing, there's still something or some things that we can do, such as cultivating online relationships, having a good conversation, even if it is via Teams or WebEx or Zoom. That can go a long way in helping us feel a little bit better.
What about children? I mean, this is so bad for them. They're isolated. They're at home online, which is so unnatural to sit in front of a camera on Zoom all day long. What is your advice for them?
Yeah, what children need more than anything else now is to be listened to. So to spend time just hearing them out, and whether they're talking about mundane, seemingly unimportant things, or whether they are sharing their emotional experiences, or whatever they need to be heard. And again, ideally face to face, but if necessary, even via technology. They just need to talk. And again, they need to be given the space to feel whatever it is that they're feeling. So it's not about saying to them, oh, you are so fortunate because there are so many people who are struggling now. That actually doesn't help. Certainly not when it's the only message that.
So you need to validate them, validate their emotions.
Exactly. Give them the permission to be human. And they are going through a hardship. Children are struggling just as adults are, and it's legitimate. In the words of Demi Lovato, it's okay not to be okay.
Well, on that note, we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back with more of Tal Ben-Shahar. Coming up, Tal Ben-Shahar tells us the science behind being happy in difficult times.
Join adults in the Palm Beaches who are finding meaning behind the texts at the root of Judaism. Federation's Commission for Jewish Education is connecting adult learners with the life-enhancing Melton School of Adult Jewish Learning. that nurtures and deepens our Jewish community worldwide. Learn more at jewishpb.org/Melton.
We're back with Tal Ben-Shahar, an expert on happiness. I have to ask you this. It surprised me to learn that Israel is one of the happiest countries in the world, ahead of the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany, but it has low income, high prices, and it's surrounded by wars. How is this possible?
Yeah, when they looked at the happiest countries in the world, what they found surprised them. It surprised researchers because it was, countries like Israel were at the top. Countries like Denmark and Australia, perhaps less surprising, but countries like Colombia, with their share of political and economic challenges. Why? The one reason, the one predictor of the happiest countries in the world: relationships, focus on social support. And you have that in Israel, you have that in Colombia, you have that in every one of the happiest countries in the world. In much of the Western world, and increasingly more sadly in the East as well, relationships are taking a back seat. Now, I'm not saying that ambition and success and work performance, these are not important. They are. However, we need to get our priorities straight. Relationships ought to reign supreme in our hierarchy of values.
How about when you were growing up in Israel? Did that play a role in your focusing in on your happiness choice?
Yeah, very much so. On two levels. First of all, being raised in Israel, just the social aspect is really strong. So our door or our neighbors' doors, they were never closed. It was always in and out interactions. Family, obviously. Whether it's the Shabbat, meals, or or just the time you spend together on daily, hourly basis. So that's one thing. The second thing, I was also raised Orthodox, and a lot of what I have learned comes from what I read in the Torah, in the Bible, in the Talmud, in Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the fathers, has so much wisdom in it that today I'm finding in academic journal articles, in the research.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go back to coping mechanisms. You talk about PTSD, which is very prevalent today with a lot of people dealing with the pandemic, and also PTG, which is post-traumatic growth. What is the difference, and can you tell us about that?
Sure. The first difference, Susan, is, when you talked about PTSD, most people knew what you were talking about. When you mentioned PTG, I bet you it was a first for many people. Now, PTG, post-traumatic growth, is twice as likely as post-traumatic stress disorder. If we know of its existence, we know of the possibility. And unfortunately, most people don't even know. It's not in their realm of possibilities, which is unfortunate. So the first thing, we need to understand that it is possible to grow as a result of trauma and hardship. First. Second, we also need to know about the right conditions in place. And we talked about some of these conditions. For example, when we're listened to, when we're truly heard, we're more likely to grow from hardship. When we keep a journal and write about our hardships and difficulties, we're more likely to grow from hardship. When we regularly exercise, when we cultivate our relationships, when we express gratitude, when we give ourselves the permission to be human, the full range of human experiences, we're more likely to grow rather than to deteriorate and break down. So post-traumatic growth is an extremely important concept, idea to think about today, to understand, and to implement.
So it all goes back to the ABCs of psychology. So exactly interesting.
Right. Think about your emotional well-being, think about what you can do, behavior, and finally about the thoughts that enter your mind.
The caregivers have been on the front lines of this pandemic, and there's something called caregiver burnout or fatigue. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of it, and there's a lot of it during normal times, whatever that means.
Right.
There's even more so today, whether it's caregiver in terms of therapists or our nurses and doctors, or parents who are spending more time giving care. What's important to keep in mind for all caregivers is that taking care of themselves is no less important. Back in the day, Susan, when we used to fly, remember?
No.
Easy before COVID, we used to be reminded to put on our oxygen mask on first before we help others. This needs to be the marching orders of caregivers. Take care of yourself as well. And what does that mean? It means going back to the basics once again. Have someone to talk to as well, who's supporting you, someone who's listening to you. Exercise, do things that are enjoyable, fun for you, even if they're brief experiences, because if we don't take care of ourselves, we'll have nothing left. We won't be able to take care of others, and we need those caregivers.
Yes, we do. We have a very large elderly population here in the Palm Beaches, and so many of them have been shut in and isolated. Can you give us some practical advice for them and how they can sustain themselves psychologically?
The important thing is to, certainly during these times, is to think small changes, not to be overly ambitious. So if we can, for instance, even, get up and walk for 5 minutes, if it has to be in our apartment, so be it. If it can be outside, even better, but just 5 minutes. Or if we can sit down and meditate for 3 minutes, either by ourselves or go on a YouTube and find a guided meditation. There are thousands of them. Make a date, whether it's a real date, if possible, or via technology to chat with someone for 20, 30 minutes, to listen and to be listened to. And again, have these small, unambitious interventions throughout the day. Watch a 20, 30-minute sitcom that makes us laugh, and do all these things consistently, regularly. This is probably the best that we can do now. And it's not little, because these small changes can and do make a big difference.
Tal, thank you so much for joining us today and reminding us how happiness can make a big difference in our lives.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Mosaic.
Coming up, we'll hear from local mental health experts on how our local community is overcoming this mental health crisis. We're back with two psychologists from Alpert Jewish Family Services, doctors Elaine Rotenberg, who's the clinical director of Jewish Family Services, and Dr. Iris Kiner, the behavioral health program administrator. Welcome to Mosaic.
Thank you, Susan. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you for having us. We're glad that you're joining us today. Both of you have been on the front line helping lots of people during the pandemic. What's your assessment of our community's mental health? Elaine, let's start with you.
Susan, it's so good to see you too. I love that question. It is a big question, and I'm going to try to give you the highlights of it. First of all, I'm so proud of our community and so proud of Jewish Family Service. We have been open through the pandemic. And I think that's probably really important to say. I love the fact that this show is going to be almost exactly a year since the pandemic started. Everything that we do in person to help families during challenging times continued, and then some during the past year. We have been busier than ever with counseling, with psychiatry, with senior services, with caring for disabled adults, with older adults in their homes. The emergency needs that we've had to face, help families with, kept families from living without a home, living in their cars, helping with rent, helping with food. I mean, it's been and continues to be quite a year. So my assessment has a lot to do with the fact that when you think about it, it's been a whole year, and people have studied pandemics and have studied the fact that at the front end of a pandemic, people worry about the physical health. How are you going to catch it? Do you have to wash off your fruit from Publix? Those kinds of things. But after the onset, there's something called a shadow pandemic, and that can last for days, weeks, months, and years after the onset. And that's where we are right now. This is not an acute situation. It didn't start and have an ending. We're now just kind of moving through an adjustment period. So that's sort of part of where we are. And yeah.
Iris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, we found that what's really interesting to think about is that prior to the start of when COVID came into our world, is we were all dealing with things going on in our lives, whether it was difficult, challenging times, medical conditions, losses of loved ones, or good things where we were planning weddings or different mitzvahs. But none of those things went away when COVID came into our world. All it did was it added another layer of stress for people. And it just made things that much more challenging. And so what was so amazing through JFS is that we've been continuing to offer all of our services, our groups. We've been able to add new groups, groups like our bereavement groups and parents who've lost adult children. We have our survivors of suicide groups and some new addiction programs that we've been able to offer. So it's just been this extra layer that COVID has added to people's stress has just made it so much more important for services that we've been able to offer.
Absolutely. And I know you're holding some remarkable workshops. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I think a year ago, almost exactly, when the pandemic started, which was it feels like it was like March 13th, actually, and then, which was a Friday. By Monday, we had to get up and have our whole agency go virtual with telehealth and all those things. And I remember saying to Iris, let's do something just to help people cope. And we put together a 1-hour workshop that really talked about framing our new reality and giving people a very specific coping tool. And we taught it one time in the Jewish community, and then we just offered it to as many people as wanted to hear it. So in the past year, we have taught this 1-hour presentation, Susan, almost 40 times to communities, to over 1,300 people in our community. We've taught it in Toronto. I consulted to the Jewish Family Service, the Jewish Federation, and I think in Montreal. I can't remember if it was Montreal or Canada. And really, it has. And we offer an open support group on Monday nights, both one for parents who are dealing with their kids being home, one for just any adult who's coping with this new reality. And it has been a tool that we have just used to help mitigate the worsening of mental health symptoms. Because if you help normalize something, if you name it, you can claim it. If we help people understand what they're dealing with, they're going to have a better time coping.
Iris, do you have anything to add?
No, the groups have just been able to, this presentation has just been able to really frame, like Elaine said, what's been going on. And we've been able to then add our coping group that we run every Monday night just to continue the conversation that we found was so necessary. After that initial workshop, we were feeling people were asking or needing more. And we thought we would run the group a couple weeks, and we're a year later, and every week we have, a full screen of people every week.
It sounds like these workshops are so successful that they should transcend the pandemic and continue throughout life.
Well, it's funny. Iris and I talk about that quite a bit because, you know, this isn't over. We're just experiencing different things now. So how do you cope with the fact that your friend is now, unfortunately, saying goodbye to a loved one and is able to go to the funeral, and you had to bury your mother or father on a Zoom screen? And how do you deal with the fact that you missed that once in a lifetime trip that you had planned, or that you're scared to go out in public right now, or you're angry at this, or there's so many things right now that the dust hasn't even begun to settle as to where we are. And so these kind of coping tools that Iris talked about are good every single day.
Are there certain segments of our demographic here in the Jewish community that have more difficulty coping with the virus than others?
Interesting question, because I wouldn't say there are certain segments that are having a more difficult time, but that are having different difficulties that they're facing. So our older population or individuals who are living alone, who are feeling very isolated, are having different struggles or challenges than those parents who are coping with, how do I do virtual school with my young children? So all very real challenges, but different in how we cope and how we navigate them.
What advice would you give to family or friends that want to help a loved one or someone struggling through this crisis?
One thing they can do is take a mental health first aid class, which is something else we offer, which is really to teach ordinary folks, not mental health folks, but ordinary folks, how to recognize a mental health crisis or a substance use crisis in a loved one. But if they don't want to do that, Susan, what they can do is be a good listener. And Iris was just alluding to that, to help to not say we're all in the same boat. That is, people think that's a very helpful thing to say, but we're really not all in the same boat. We've been navigating a very similar storm, but our boats are very different depending on who's in our household, what our resources are, what our community support is, what our family support is, and be a good listener.
It's quite apparent that Alpert Jewish Family Services is so needed and so vital to our community. And I want to thank both of you for all that you're doing in your work. And thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, as usual.